Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. Saving the groom from himself. Chapter 1. Ned Connor tipped the bottle back and guzzled down the whiskey it contained. He leaned his head back as he sat on the fence rail and howled at the moon. He wanted to howl. He wanted to howl, and scream, and moan with despair. Why was he still on this earth? He used to be happy. He'd been married to the sweetest, prettiest woman in the West. He owned his ranch, the Circle C, and it was one of the richest ranches in the area of Bitterroot Valley, Montana. He had loved his wife, loved his work, and knew how to laugh back then. Not anymore. That ended the day his wife Luann and his baby died as she struggled to give birth to his son. Now, there was no more laughter, just heartbreak. He took another slug of whiskey. It had been over 2 years since Mary passed, but it still felt like it was yesterday. He missed her so badly, it felt as if part of his soul had been ripped out. Dear God, why did you take her? Why? Now it seemed like he could only find comfort in the bottle. He tilted his head back and drained the rest of the contents. He went too far, though, and tumbled right off the fence rail onto the ground. Good Lord. He lay there looking up at the sky whirling overhead. Hey, Ned, buddy. Ben Davies hurried up to his friend and boss and hefted his shoulders off the ground. I think you've had enough for tonight. Come on. Let me help you to your room. With Ben's help, Ned climbed shakily to his feet, still clutching the empty bottle. I'm okay, Ben. I'm okay. I know you are, pal. You just need some rest. Let's go in. He grabbed Ned around the waist and helped him stagger toward the big ranch house, the house that used to be a showplace but now needed paint. You ought to just leave me out there for the wolves, Ned muttered as he lurched onto the porch. Ben opened the door and guided him inside. Nah. You're too tough for those critters. Tough? Ned bellowed. I'm not tough at all. I'm a weakling. I don't have any strength left. Now, you're talking nonsense. You're the strongest man I know, Ben said as he led Ned toward the stairs. I'm not. I'm like a little kid who's lost his mommy. Ned hollered the words and tried to get more whiskey out of the empty bottle. When he was unsuccessful, he threw the bottle against the wall and it smashed with a bang, glass splattering everywhere. The noise brought his mother Catherine dashing out of her room at the top of the stairs to stare aghast at her son. Catherine moved swiftly to help Ben get Ned up the rest of the stairs and into his room. When the journey was finally complete, Ned collapsed atop the bed, immediately beginning to snore, tears damp on his face. Catherine stared down at her son, her heart breaking as she looked at him. He was just a remnant of the man he used to be. Ben, this has gone on long enough. We've got to do something. I know, Catherine, I know, but what? I don't know. All I know is I can't take seeing him like this anymore. We'll come up with something. Asterisk. Sister Agnes sat at the small wooden table in her room with the newspaper spread out before her. She'd already searched the adverts for what she was hunting for and found some affordable plowing equipment the convent needed. Now she was simply looking over the rest of the adverts out of curiosity. A person never knew what he or she might come across. There was an advert from a desperate mother searching for someone to help her son, a lonely widower who had lost both his wife and his baby a couple of years ago. Now, it seemed he was a lost soul in need of someone to help him find the right direction. The poor man was floundering, purposeless. The mother, Catherine Connor from Bitterroot Valley, Montana, was pleading for help, for someone with a Christian heart to give her son meaning to his life. Sister Agnes studied the advert for a few minutes. It was listed under the mail-order bride section, but the ad didn't mention marriage. It was just asking for help. And Sister Agnes knew the perfect woman to fit the bill. Josephine Brooks was a 22-year-old who had come to live at the convent many years before when she was orphaned. Sister Agnes had taken the child in and raised her like her own. She was a dear girl, rich with love and compassion. Josephine wanted to become a nun, to serve the Lord and do His work, and that was fine and honorable. But Agnes knew it was not a decision to be made lightly. Josephine had not known life outside the convent, so she wasn't prepared to make that decision based on facts. She just knew the peace and serenity of life in the convent, surrounded by sisters, isolated from the real world. Now Agnes worried she had kept Josephine too insulated, too protected from the other aspects of life. She'd never been to a proper school, never truly socialized with other people her own age, never traveled even 20 miles outside of the convent. This might be the perfect opportunity for Josephine to explore the world and see some of what was out there, something besides the church. Agnes knew Josephine would make a good wife and mother. She was cheerful, happy, and responsible. She possessed all the qualities necessary to be a good spouse and parent. Of course, Josephine would also make an excellent nun, but she needed to know her options. She needed to be amongst people who lived outside the church to be able to make an intelligent decision to return to the fold. And being a nun wasn't the only way to serve the Lord. Raising children in the way of God was another. Being a good helpmate was also a service to God. Yes, Agnes was going to talk to Josephine about this. If Josephine decided to do it, Agnes would miss her terribly, but she wanted Josephine to make the right decision, and she couldn't do that if she didn't know what else life had to offer. Agnes folded the paper and rose resolutely to her feet. There was no time like the present to get the job done. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Josephine tossed the ball back to Sandy, the littlest orphan at the convent. Sandy giggled and ran after it, his little legs pumping as fast as they could go. Josephine laughed in delight as she watched him run. Working with the children who lived here was one of the greatest rewards of her life. She loved children and was always happy when she spent time with them. Her brunette hair tumbled around her face, already having come loose from the bun she had pulled it into earlier. Her cheeks were flushed, her brown eyes twinkling. Sandy threw the ball back at her, and Josephine dove to scoop it up, then tossed it his way again. The bell rang, alerting the children that it was time for dinner, and Sandy and the others took off running toward the dining hall. Josephine stayed behind to gather up forgotten toys. She looked up and saw Sister Agnes approaching her and paused to wait for her. "Good afternoon, Josephine. Do you have a minute to talk?" "Of course. Would you like to sit on the bench over there?" Sister Agnes nodded, and they moved to rest on the bench that sat under a tree. Sister Agnes produced the newspaper and showed Josephine the advert, waiting patiently while she read it. "That's interesting, sister, but why show it to me?" "Because I feel strongly that God showed it to me so I could convince you to help this man." "I think you should do it, Josephine." "What? Why would you think that?" "You know I've already decided what I want to do with my future. I'm going to be a nun, to follow the Lord and live to do His work." "That is a beautiful goal, Josephine, but becoming a nun is not the only way to accomplish it. You know, the Bible says in Philippians 2 verse 4, let each of you look not only to his own interests but also to the interests of others." "Yes, but I can do that as a nun." Agnes looked at her folded hands and didn't speak for a moment. When she did reply at last, she turned her gaze lovingly on Josephine. "Jo, I know you think you want to be a nun, but you have never explored any other possibilities. You have not been out amongst people, you haven't seen any other places besides St. Michael's, and you haven't experienced anything other than life in the church. It would make me happy if you didn't close your mind to other prospects." Josephine sat thoughtfully for a few moments, then asked, "If I did this, could I still come back here afterward and become a nun?" "Of course, if that is what you still want to do." "Let me pray about it, sister. I will give you my answer tomorrow." She stood and took her leave. That evening, Josephine could think of little else. She was determined to say no, but something in her spirit stopped her. Finally, during the wee hours of the morning, she gave in. She would go. But she would come back, too, and take her place as a nun just like she'd always intended. Chapter 2. Josephine spent an exciting week as she traveled to Montana. She had seen many sights like magnificent forests and rolling plains, rushing rivers and majestic mountains. She'd seen people from all walks of life, city folks, Indians, and cowboys, farmers, and peddlers. She'd even slept in a hotel room for the first time in her life. It was a little scary when she heard a brawl going on just outside her window, but it was on the street below, and she survived it. This trip had made her feel like a grown-up instead of a child. Now the train was pulling into her destination. She didn't know what to expect when she got off. This was all new territory to her, not just the geography, but the whole experience. She would be living with strangers in an unfamiliar land with an unfamiliar culture. She was here to help a heartbroken man, but she had no idea how to do that. In fact, she didn't know much about men at all. Then a verse from Isaiah in the Bible came to her, "For I the Lord thy God will hold thy right hand, saying unto thee, Fear not, I will help thee." She drew on the comfort the words offered her and wrapped her hand around the simple gold cross she wore around her neck. She then smoothed down the wrinkles on her new simple calico dress. She would get through this. With that thought, she gathered her belongings and climbed down from the train. The station was small but tidy. A few people milled around, some greeting other passengers descending from the train, others preparing to board. She stood still and waited for someone to approach her. A young, nice-looking man came in her direction, and she thought maybe that was Ned Connor, but he introduced himself as Benjamin Davies, Ned's best friend. He said he also worked for Ned. "Let's get in the wagon, and we'll head out to the ranch. It'll take about an hour to get there, so hopefully, we'll arrive before dark." Josephine nodded, and they loaded her luggage into the buckboard. Ben clicked to the horses and Josephine started the last leg of her journey. Ben was easy to talk to. The trip went smoothly as they chatted all the way there. Josephine took in the scenery as they rolled along, amazed by the natural beauty of the area. Mountains surrounded the valley, the Sapphire Mountains to the east, the Bitterroot Mountains to the west. Awe-inspiring peaks scraped the azure skies, and the slopes were covered in forests. They passed fields with steers roaming across the rugged terrain and rabbits occasionally bounced across the road in front of the wagon. Josephine's gaze darted everywhere trying to take in all the sights. "This is the most beautiful countryside I've ever seen," Josephine said in an awestruck voice. "It is incredible," Ben agreed. "It's not quite as nice in the middle of winter, though. It's really cold and believe me, we get a lot of snow. I bet that's beautiful, too." "Oh, it is stunning. Especially if you see it from indoors." He chuckled as he said that, and Josephine couldn't help but join in. "We're going to cross the Bitterroot River now," he told her as they approached a long wooden bridge. "Some of the best fishing in the world is right there." Josephine sucked in a breath as they rattled over the bridge and she watched the water swirling below. It seemed every place she looked, there was more natural beauty to enjoy. God had certainly outdone himself when he created this part of Montana. "How much farther until we get to the ranch?" she asked. "Technically we're on it now. This land is all part of the Circle C. It must be quite large." "You're right about that. A couple more hills, and you'll be able to see the ranch house. I bet you'll be glad to get there, won't you?" "I am tired of traveling, to tell you the truth. It feels as if I've been on the road for weeks." "Well, it's almost over now." A few minutes later, they came over a rise, and in the distance, Josephine could see the ranch. There were acres of paddocks, a large bunkhouse, and a big barn. What captured her interest the most, however, was the big house at the end of the curving drive. It sat atop a hill like a crown on the head of a king. A wide porch ran around the base of the two-story house, and a balcony hovered overhead. Green grass surrounded it, and several huge trees towered in the yard. The house was white but appeared to need a fresh coat of paint. Same with the faded blue porch, and the barn also looked a little weather-worn. They rode under an arched sign with Circle C burned into the wood. 2 black and white collies came barking at the wagon, their tails wagging wildly. "Mike, Molly, hush now," Ben called to the dogs as he pulled the wagon up in front of the porch. The door immediately opened and a slender woman with black hair peppered with silver came out onto the porch. She was smiling widely, her bright blue eyes were twinkling. She opened her arms to welcome Josephine. "Josephine, welcome. I'm Catherine. Call me Kate. I'm so grateful and happy you made the trip." She hugged Josephine warmly, pulling her close. "I'm sorry my son Ned's not here right now to meet you. He should be home soon, though. Meantime, please come in." Josephine followed her into the house and looked around curiously. It was a beautiful place. She entered into a wide foyer, the floors of gleaming hardwoods, a glittering chandelier hanging from the ceiling. A wide curving staircase ran up the back wall and pocket doors opened off of either side of the foyer. A large parlor sat on the right, a dining room on the left. Everywhere she looked beautiful furniture stood. "Oh, your home is lovely, Kate," she said in awe. She wasn't used to such luxurious surroundings. "Thank you. My late husband and Ned worked very hard to build this ranch, and I couldn't be prouder of it. I'll be happy to give you the full tour later, but right now I'm sure you're exhausted and would like to see your room." "That would be nice. I need to freshen up a bit." They headed up the staircase and Josephine followed Kate down a long hall to a room on the left. They entered and Josephine again gasped at the beauty of the space. A 4-poster bed stood in the middle of the room across from a fireplace. A luxurious rug covered most of the floor. A tall boy stood against one wall, a dresser against another. 4 windows allowed the light from the setting sun to pour into the room, and French doors opened onto the balcony. "It's so lovely," Josephine breathed, running her hand across the rose-colored duvet. "I can't believe how beautiful it is. I want you to feel at home here, Joe. Is it all right if I call you Joe?" "Yes, of course. I hope you're comfortable and happy in this room, and I want you to consider this house your home. I'm so grateful you came. I know it wasn't an easy trip. It was hard but very interesting. You came out of the goodness of your heart to help Ned, and that means the world to me. He's had a hard time the past couple of years, and he's not doing well. I hope you'll be patient with him. I'll do my best. I can't promise any miracles, though. Of course not. I was desperate, though, and anything you can do to help will be greatly appreciated." Kate blinked as if she were about to cry, and Josephine felt her heartstrings pull. On impulse, she reached out and hugged the older woman who returned the embrace warmly. "Now, I'll leave you alone to freshen up. There's water in the pitcher and towels and washcloths in the tallboy. When you're ready, come downstairs and we'll have dinner." When Josephine was alone, she quickly washed up and changed clothes. Then she took a few moments to look around some more. She'd never had a room like this before. Everything was clean and bright, yet it felt cozy and warm at the same time. She walked over to the French doors and flung them open, stepping out onto the balcony to take in the view. It was stunning. The sun was just beginning to slide behind the snow-capped mountains, spreading an array of rainbow colors across the sky. Pastures spread out for what seemed like miles around the house, horses grazing in nearby fields. A stream bubbled and danced like a curving silver snake through the fields, and there was a haze of spring green over the forests as they donned their summer coat. Pine trees filled in the background, climbing up the steep hills. She heard the sound of a horse galloping up the drive and turned her gaze to see who was coming. Was this Ned? She watched as he rode toward the barn, slumped in his saddle. Ben came out of the barn and greeted him, then began shaking his head before he helped the rider down from his horse. The tall man stumbled, his cowboy hat falling from his head to reveal a mop of cat-black hair. He shook Ben's arm off of his own brawny one and said something in an angry tone. She couldn't make out the words but could tell they weren't friendly. A shouting match ensued, and then the black-haired man hauled off and punched Ned right in the nose. Chapter 3. Josephine gasped and her hands flew over her mouth. She pulled up her skirts and raced down the stairs, bumping into Kate at the bottom. "Kate, some horrid man just punched Ben in the nose. I saw it from the balcony. Come on." She dashed out the door and ran toward where the two men were grappling in the dirt. The horse stood nearby moving restlessly, making Josephine worry that one of the combatants would get trampled. "Stop. Stop that fighting this instant," she hollered as she ran up to them and stomped her feet to get their attention. "You should both be ashamed of yourselves." She skidded to a halt and watched in wonder as Ben started laughing, rolling onto his back and letting loose a loud snicker. "It's okay, Joe, it's just Ben and Ned duking it out again. Ned, behave yourself and get up and meet Miss Josephine Brooks. Josephine, this is my incorrigible son, Ned." The black-haired man rose to his feet and towered over Josephine, tilting a little as he tried to stand up straight. "Nice to meet you, Mississippi." Josephine's coffee-brown eyes flashed to meet his clear blue eyes that looked just like his mother's. He weaved and tipped an imaginary hat since his still lay on the ground a few feet away. A smirk crossed his face that showed off white, straight teeth. Josephine's hands clamped across her mouth and fire rose in her cheeks. Then anger replaced embarrassment. "Well, that's a fine how do you do. The two of you, grown men, brawling in the dirt like two schoolboys. What is wrong with you?" "Just the same thing that's been wrong with us for the last 35 years. Ned snickered. "What he means, Joe, is that these two have known each other ever since they were in swaddling clothes, and they've been fighting over something and everything ever since. Ben's daddy, Big Ben, was Ned's daddy's foreman. They both died in an avalanche in '78 and Ben's mother died a year later. Ben's lived in the big house with us ever since. Now somebody has gone and said something wrong, and they're at it again." "That's right, Miss Josephine. That's exactly what happened." Ben looked a little shamefaced as he admitted it. "Well, I'm sorry I jumped to conclusions." Josephine tried to sound sincere as she said it, but inside she was still a bit angry. "I bet it wouldn't have happened, though, if this one," she tossed her head at Ned, "hadn't have been drinking. You, sir, smell like a brewery." With that, she tilted her nose and made her way back to the house. ****. "Josephine, wait, please," Catherine called out to her, and looked at her with sadness in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. That's part of the problem with Ned, now. Ever since his wife and baby died, he's turned to the bottle for comfort. He's not like he used to be." Josephine tilted her head as she listened. She didn't want to feel sorry for the man, but she did. She couldn't imagine losing her family. Yes, she had lost her parents, but she'd been so young she didn't even remember them. Just faint scraps of memories, a blonde-haired woman with a lilting voice and a big man who carried her on his shoulder. Still, she was uncomfortable being here around a man who drank too much, who had given up on life. "I think maybe it would be best if I went back to St. Michael's," she whispered. "Please, Josephine, for my sake, please, stay a little while. I know Ned is a shock to a gentle, Christian girl like you, but I really need you to try and help him. I don't know what else to do." Catherine took hold of her hands, and her eyes pleaded with Josephine. A Bible verse from 1 Thessalonians popped into Josephine's head, "And we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all." Patience. That was something Josephine often found herself short of. But the Lord was commanding her to be patient now. Reluctantly, she nodded her head, and Catherine hugged her with relief. ****. Ned skipped dinner that night and went straight to bed, but he had trouble sleeping. Visions of a petite girl with bark-colored hair kept dancing through his mind. What a little firecracker Josephine was. And talk about pretty. He could still see the lovely rose staining her porcelain cheeks, the rich, velvety brown of her wide eyes. He felt a stirring in his body that he hadn't felt for over 2 years, and confusion washed through him. Why would he feel desire for a tiny shrew? Maybe it was just because he'd been so long without a woman. Or maybe because he was just plain lonely. Whatever the reason, he needed to get over it. He didn't know why she was here, but something warned him that it would come to no good. She was supposedly the daughter of a friend of his mother's, but he had no idea who that was. Something was up, he could feel it. It was probably another one of his mother's schemes to shake him back to the way he used to be. But he didn't want to be that way again. He didn't want to be happy all the time. He didn't feel like singing anymore or even working the ranch the way it should be worked. He didn't want to do anything but crawl into a bottle and drown himself. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Catherine sat in her bedroom, her Bible open on her lap, but she wasn't really reading it. She was lost in her thoughts instead. She was worried about Ned. She'd tried everything to shake him out of his blinding grief, but nothing seemed to work. And he'd already probably blown her plan to have Josephine feel compassion for him, to see beneath the gloom and negativity he wallowed in. They would be lucky if she even stayed a week, let alone long enough to have an effect on Ned's attitude. The girl was prettier than Catherine had hoped she would be. Her face was painted with innocence, her heart pure and good. She was younger than she thought she would be, also, and that was another problem. Ned was only 35, but he seemed to have aged decades in the past 2 years. He no longer had that spark of youth, that vivaciousness that came with being young and happy. She wasn't even sure his once large sense of humor had survived this tragedy. She remembered Ned as he used to be, always laughing, working hard to make the ranch the best it could be, kind to both people and animals. He used to go around singing, making jokes, and always ready and willing to help his neighbors. Now, he rarely smiled and had practically turned into a hermit. Unless he went into town to the saloon, that is. She sighed wearily and dropped to her knees at her bedside. "Dear Lord," she prayed, "please don't let me have made a terrible mistake. Please don't let me have drugged that sweet girl into a hornet's nest. Please, help me make this turn out all right." Chapter 4. Dear Sister Josephine, I hope this missive finds you and the others at the convent all well and healthy. I miss you all, and I Mississippi St. Michael's as well. The city is what I'm used to and what feels like home to me. Montana, however, is stunningly striking. The mountains that surround the ranch reach up and touch the sky, cloaked in white snowcaps even in the spring. I see eagles soaring from those peaks, sailing across skies so blue it hurts your eyes. There are so many stars visible at night that it seems like you're about to be buried beneath a blanket of sparkling diamonds. The sounds here are different as well. I hear wolves howling at night and cattle mooing all the time. The wind sings through the pine trees and all kinds of birds are calling even as I write this letter. They also raise horses here on the ranch, so they can be heard snorting and neighing, running and playing all day. The beauty here is overwhelming. It is God's handiwork at its finest. Catherine Connor, or Kate, as she prefers to be called, is a wonderful woman. She's taught me how to keep sourdough batter going and she's even teaching me how to knit. She is a virtuous woman, and we often pray together for guidance and direction in dealing with her son's problems. I am sad to say that I have made no progress with Ned Connor, however. He is a man wrapped in sadness. It is visible in his face and you can almost feel the despair radiating from him. He doesn't talk much to me. In fact, I wonder if he even acknowledges my presence in his mind. He does share most meals with the family, but his heart is not present. He also scares me a bit. He drinks too much while looking for solace from his loss. He is good-looking, but he is a big man. Very big. He towers over me and could snap me in half if he chose to. He does not seem to be naturally violent, but I can't forget seeing him attack Ben the first time I ever saw him. I ran into him in the hallway that serves the bedrooms, and he was scowling so hard he looked as if he could bite my head off. I must admit, sister, that I am not sure if I will be able to help him. He seems so bitter and lost. He pays no attention to me, even seems to avoid me. I am praying the Lord will show me a way to get through to him, but I do not feel like I am having any success at all. Pray that I will soon find a way, or I may conclude I have failed at this mission and have no choice but to return to St. Michael's. Yours in the Lord, Josephine. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Josephine finished writing the letter and sealed it. There was an ache in her heart as she wrote the address on the envelope. She did miss Sister Agnes and the city of St. Michael's. Part of her wanted to just join the letter on its journey back to Maryland, but part of her hated to quit a challenge. She'd come here to help Ned, and she was failing miserably. She did not like to fail at anything. Kate was going to town today and would mail the letter for her, so Josephine hurried down the stairs and gave it to the other woman. Are you sure you want to make this trip on your own, Kate? What if something happens along the way? Don't you worry, Joe. I'll be fine. I've lived out here long enough to learn how to take care of myself, and I'll have my rifle with me. You stay here and take care of things, and I'll be back late this afternoon. If you're certain. I'm sure. Besides, I need you to make supper for the men, and I'll eat when I get home. All right? Yes, of course. Go with God, Kate. Kate nodded and set off to make the journey into town. The sun was shining, and she clearly didn't expect any problems. Josephine watched her go, then turned and went to the kitchen to bake some bread. When that was finished, she swept the floor and dusted the furniture, then took a walk outside to watch the horses for a bit. There was a mare with a new colt that she loved to observe. They were entirely captivating. She noticed thunderclouds roiling in the west, moving in over the mountain peaks. Hopefully, Kate would make it back before the storm broke. Josephine returned to the house as the wind picked up, holding on to her bonnet to keep it from blowing off. The rain started falling just as she reached the porch. The storm came in quickly and fiercely. Thunder boomed and lightning flashed, trees bending earthward as the winds assaulted them. Once again, Josephine worried that Kate might be out in the elements and prayed that she was somewhere warm and dry. The rain came down relentlessly, completely obstructing her vision. She didn't even see Ben until he was practically on the porch approaching the entrance. Ben, come in and get out of that rain. Goodness, you're soaked. She threw the door open and greeted him as he dashed up the steps. Can't do it, Joe. I just wanted to let you know that I'll be down in the barn. Got a mare in labor, and she's not doing well. I was hoping I could get a pot of coffee from you to take back there with me. Of course. Is Ned down there with you? She hurried toward the kitchen as she hollered over her shoulder. No. Last I knew, he was out checking fences. This storm came up so fast, he probably took shelter in a lined shack or something. I hope so. It's not fit for any human to be out in this. I just hope Catherine's all right. I'm sure she is. She would have seen the storm coming and stayed in town until it passes. Josephine prepared the coffee and carried it back to him. I hope the mare comes through okay, Ben. I don't know how I could help, but if you think I could, I'm willing to come down there. No, everything will be okay. Just stay here and stay dry. He hurried off carrying the coffee pot, his figure swallowed up by the rain before he was 10 feet away. Josephine watched him go, then turned and headed back inside. It was still mid-afternoon but was so dark that she hurried to light some lamps and reduce the gloom inside the house. The afternoon was long, the house echoing with emptiness. Josephine tried to stay busy, baking cookies and mopping the kitchen floor, but time still seemed to drag without Kate's company. Neither man showed up for supper, so Josephine just made herself a ham sandwich and put two together for Ben. She wrapped herself in a heavy cloak, slipped on her boots, and carried the sandwiches to the barn so he could eat and still stay with the pregnant horse. He was surprised to see her when she let herself in the door. Joe, you shouldn't have come out in this rain. He hurried to point out a nearby bale of hay for her to sit on. I'm glad you did, though. My stomach was starting to think my throat had been slit. Josephine laughed and sat down, shaking back the hood of her cloak. It was too quiet in the house. The thunder and lightning have quit, but the rain is still non-stop. I felt trapped and needed to escape for a minute or two. Mike, the bigger of the two dogs, came up to greet her, Molly at his side. She reached out and patted both their heads and received happy tail wags in return. "How is the horse doing?" "I think she's starting to make a little more progress." He pointed to the mare in the nearest stable. The poor girl stood there breathing heavily, her head hanging down. She looked exhausted. "Are you sure she's okay?" "She seems about done in. She'll get through it. This is her 4th birthing. She's an old pro at this. Look, you can see the baby moving." He pointed at her sides, and to Josephine's amazement, she saw the horse's sides ripple with motion. "It shouldn't be much longer now." "Oh, I hope not, poor girl. I feel sorry for her. This is what it takes to give life." "I know, but that doesn't make it any easier to watch. I'm here with her. I'll help her if she gets in trouble." "Bless you, Ben. Bless you for bringing me the sandwiches." He chuckled. Josephine made her way back to the house and was just going to let herself in when she heard hooves coming up the road. She peered through the rain and saw a figure slumped in the saddle. It was Ned's horse heading up the lane, a big, black stallion. Just as it reached the house, the rider slid out of the saddle and landed on the ground. "Drunk again," Josephine muttered and eyed the man lying in the rain. He didn't move despite the fact that he was soaking wet and the rain was pounding on his face. "Oh, for pity's sake." She pulled her hood tighter around her face and headed over to check on him. She knelt on the ground next to him, her knees sinking in the mud. "Ned, come on, don't do this now. It's pouring down rain, and we need to get inside." He didn't move, lying perfectly still. She reached out and shook his shoulder, calling his name repeatedly. Woe to those who are heroes in drinking wine, and valiant men in mixing strong drink. She murmured the Bible verse as she tried to wake him. His only response was to moan and turn to the side. And that's when she saw it. Blood. Blood pouring from his side. Chapter 5. Dearest God, he wasn't drunk. He was injured. She quickly made the sign of the cross and started praying as she pulled at his shirt to bare the wound. It was an ugly gash, flesh ripped and blood leaking steadily from the cut. She didn't know what to do. Fear washed through her, and for a few seconds, panic threatened to overcome her. Then she managed to draw a deep breath and turn to the Lord for help. She knew she couldn't get him in the house by herself. So she got to her feet and ran to the barn to get Ben to help her. "Ben. Ben, it's Ned. He's hurt. Come help me." Ben was standing next to the horse, who now had a wobbly colt next to her. "He's bleeding from his side." Ben spun away from the newborn and dashed out into the rain. He ran and knelt at Ned's side. "We've got to get him out of this rain. Can you help?" "Yes, of course. You take his feet then, and I'll get his head." Ben moved into position and Josephine moved down and took hold of his booted feet. "Ready? 1, 2, 3, up." Josephine was shocked by how heavy he was. She managed to lift his legs and stumbled forward as they carried him. She had trouble getting him up the stairs, but they finally made it. "Let's get him on the sofa." By the time they deposited him, Josephine was gasping for breath. She'd been terrified she would drop him, but she had managed to make it. Her legs were weak and trembling, but she was grateful she had managed to carry him all the way. "Okay, let's take a look." Ben seemed calm and in control, and Josephine was thankful for his presence. She didn't know what she would have done if she had been alone. "Looks like he got gored," Ben announced. "Let's hope it didn't hit anything vital." "I'll get towels," Josephine said, and ran to collect the cloths she needed to press against his side and try to stop the bleeding. She prayed that it wasn't a fatal wound, but it did look bad. "I'm going to get him out of these wet clothes. Can you help me with his boots?" She tugged and pulled and finally managed to get the leather boots off of him, and then went to change out of her own dripping wet clothes. When she returned, Ben was just finishing getting Ned into a dry pair of pants, his chest still bare. "I thought it would be best if I left his shirt off so we can get to the wound." She remained speechless, her gaze locked on the prone man's bare chest. A wide expanse of bronzed flesh spread before her, a soft mat of black curls covering his chest and arrowing down to disappear beneath his pants. Muscles were well-defined and his shoulders were broad. I'm going to ride and see if I can get into town and get the doctor. This wound needs a doc's expert hand, but I'm not sure I'll make it. This is the kind of storm that causes flash floods. I doubt I'll be able to cross the river, but I'll try. Are you sure you should try? What if you don't make it? Then I'll come back. You'll have to watch him while I'm gone. You got any experience with this sort of thing? Never. Not with anything this bad. No. Not really. Just children's scapes. You'll be all right. You got a good head on you. And I'll be back, with or without the doc. Be careful, Ben, please. Ride with God. Then he was gone, and Josephine was alone with Ned. He looked so still, so gray. She noticed he was starting to shiver, so she hurried to collect some blankets and brought them back to cover him, careful to arrange them over the makeshift bandaging. Now his teeth were chattering, and she wished there was some way to warm him. She tucked the blankets closer, trying her best to preserve his heat. At first, she was afraid to leave him, but she did escape for a moment to brew a pot of coffee. When she returned, she pulled a chair close to his side and sat sipping her coffee, prayers running through her mind. God, don't let him die. When he began to shake violently from the cold, she didn't know what to do. He had a fever but was still chilling. She watched him shiver and shake, and then she made a decision. She couldn't think of any other source of warmth, so she stretched out beside him on the sofa, draping her leg and arm over him, pulling him close to her. It felt foreign to be laying up against a man. And awkward. She was ashamed to be doing it, but she was desperate, feeling that God would forgive her the impropriety. She could feel every inch of him pressed against her, his body hot and solid beside her. When he continued to shake, she went even farther and laid on top of him, careful to not disturb his wound, her hands resting against his bare chest, her cheek pressed against his flesh. She felt him breathing in and out and could feel the shivers slow. It was working. She even fell asleep for a little bit as she laid on top of him. She jerked awake when he moaned. She rolled off of him. Now, he felt hot to the touch. He was running a high fever, she was almost sure of it. Now what? She brought a basin of cool water in and wet a cloth to run across his face, and then wiped it over his torso. God, she hoped she was doing the correct thing. But the bleeding had slowed to a stop. The wound was still an ugly gash and she saw that it needed cleaned, but she was afraid to disturb it. Surely the doctor would arrive soon. She tried to think about what Sister Agnes would do to help him and felt like bathing him in cool cloths was the right step. She needed to keep his fever down. She was worried because he wasn't showing any signs of waking up. His eyes didn't open and he was very still, just emitting the occasional moan. Worry ate at her and she reached out and took hold of his hand, urging him to be okay. She whispered a prayer as she held his hand, praying that he would wake up soon. Josephine jerked as she heard the front door open. She turned and saw Ben standing there dripping wet. I couldn't make it. The bridge is flooded and the river way too high to swim the horse across. I guess we're on our own. Josephine's heart sank. She didn't know what to do. She dressed the wound, but it was bleeding again, still oozing. Should I try to stitch it up? She asked. But it needs cleaned. The blood has washed away most of the rock bits and dirt, but I'm worried. I think we should clean it and stitch it. If it didn't hit any vital organs, I think that's the best we can do. Fear settled over her heart once again as she went and got her sewing kit. She was a good seamstress, but she certainly had never stitched up a human being before. God, guide my hands. Please let this be the right thing to do. Ben had cleaned the wound somewhat, and it looked a bit better. When her needle was threaded, she sat down by Ned's side and studied the wound. She couldn't see any intestines or anything else important looking sticking out. Her hands were shaking as she began to sew his flesh together. He moaned occasionally and pulled away from the pain. Every time he did, she moaned, too, and had to stop until her hands quit trembling, but at last she was finished. Very neat stitches, Josephine, Ben murmured as he checked out her work. That looks fine to me. I just hope it's good enough, she murmured. Ben laid his hand on her shoulder and said, It's got to be. Now, why don't you go get some rest and let me stay with him a while? She shook her head firmly. No. You're the one who's been out in the weather. You go rest, and I'll stay with him. Are you sure? She nodded, her lips set in a straight line. She didn't want to leave him. She didn't know why, but she felt compelled to stay. Chapter 6. It was still raining in the morning. Ben found Josephine nodding off in the chair next to Ned, her head falling to the side. She stirred when he walked in the room, and as soon as she woke, she jumped up to bend over to check on Ned. His color was better and his eyes flickered open as she pulled the covers down to check on his wound. A radiant smile lit up her face when she realized he was awake. Ned, welcome back. How are you feeling? I feel like I got stomped on by a bull, he muttered, flinching as he moved a bit. I think you did, buddy, Ben said as he, too, bent over to check on his friend. What happened? Darn, stupid mistake. I was mending some fence and got lost in my thoughts. I didn't hear the bull coming up behind me. By the time I saw him, he was coming after me. I just about made it to my horse when he got me with his horns. Well, you're one lucky man. You managed to get on that horse and get all the way back home riding through that storm. Josephine found you lying in the mud, and we managed to get you inside. She even sewed you up. Thanks, Josephine. That's all I can say. I was glad to do it. I'm just pleased you're still with us. He nodded, but his eyes were beginning to droop again. In another moment, he drifted off to sleep, but this time it seemed to be an easier sleep and his fever was gone. Now, little mother, will you go get some sleep? Ben asked as he smiled down at her. She returned his smile and moved to go upstairs but paused at the bottom step. You'll stay with him, won't you? I'll be right here until you come back, he assured her. Chapter 7. Ned watched Josephine as she moved around caring for his needs. She changed the dressings on his wound, combed his hair, and brought him a clean shirt. This was the second day since he'd been injured, and she had nursed him continuously. Ben was there to help him with his private needs, but Josephine took care of everything else. Now, she carried a tray into his room and settled it over his lap. She reached around him and fluffed the pillows, making sure he was sitting up so he could eat. He glanced at the tray and saw she had made him a delicious-looking omelet, muffins, ham, and coffee. He had to admit, Josephine was a good cook. He didn't think he was hungry, but the sight of the golden eggs and the aroma of the fresh-baked muffins made his stomach growl. He took a bite as he watched her open the curtains over the windows and pick up some clothes he'd left lying on a chair the morning before he got hurt. She moved with efficiency, gliding around the room with graceful motions. He had been surprised by the attention she'd paid him since his accident. After all, he hadn't been exactly cordial to her since she'd been there. Some might even say he'd been cold. That didn't seem to matter to Josephine, however. She'd treated him with nothing but kindness. More than he deserved. Your mom managed to get word to us that she's staying in town a couple of days to help those who were displaced by the floods, she said. I wonder if there's anything I could do to help. You've been doing quite a bit right here, he told her. You've gone out of your way to help me. She turned toward him and widened her eyes in surprise. No more than anyone else would do. I think you've done a lot more. You've cooked for me, sewn me up, stayed by my side while I was hurting. I really want to thank you for that. Well, you're welcome, Ned, but I think you're wrong. I think any good Christian woman would have done the same. Maybe that's the difference. I mean, the Christian part. Maybe I just don't know that many Christian women. Not since Luann died, anyway. I'm sure you're mistaken, Ned. Most people are good if you just look for the good in them. He didn't answer, just stuffed a piece of ham into his mouth and eyed her curiously. Anyway, I think a lot of people have probably tried to help you. Maybe you just weren't ready to accept that help. He nodded thoughtfully, then shoved his plate away. I'd like to shave. Do you think you could get my things together for me? Yes, I'll do that. She gathered his shaving supplies and brought him some warm water, then stood by and watched him rake the razor over his skin. You act like you've never seen a man shave before, he muttered as his hand slipped and he nicked himself. I haven't, she replied. I've never been around a man doing his morning cleanup routine. Not even your father? No. I'm an orphan and was raised by the nuns at the convent. No men there, she said with a smile. I'm sorry. I didn't know. It's all right. The nuns have been very good to me and taught me so much. It would have been much harder without them. I love them like family. Ned again studied her. So she had lost her parents. How could she be so cheerful all the time, he wondered. She had no one, yet she smiled constantly. He had even heard her singing as she went about the chores around the house. Maybe there was something he could learn from her. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Josephine gathered supplies in a basket, placing jars of canned goods next to a bag of flour and 2 loaves of bread. Ben had told her about a family that lived close to the river who had lost nearly everything in the flood, and she wanted to help them out. He'd gone to hitch the wagon up for her and loaded the back of it with blankets, pillows, and some extra clothing they had. She was about to leave to take it to them when she heard footsteps behind her. Ned, what are you doing out of bed? I was going stir crazy. I'm not used to laying around all the time, you know? I feel better, so I need to do something. Well, I'm getting ready to go to the Blackwells. Ben said they lost nearly everything in the flood, so I'm taking them some of the extra things your family has. I'd like to go with you. Do you really think that's a good idea? It's only been 4 days since you got hurt. She looked at him with concern, shaking her head. I don't think you should come. Don't be silly. I'm fine. All I've got to do now is finish healing. I'm not helpless. Besides, you aren't used to it out here. What would you do if you came across a bear, I'm at least capable of shooting a gun if necessary. She hesitated, unsure what to say. She really didn't think he was ready to venture out, but he brought up a good point. What would she do if a bear wandered across her path? Finally, she nodded. Okay, but remember, I warned you against it. Yes, little worrier. Now, let's go. The sky was so blue overhead that if there hadn't been puddles still standing in the road, a person would have never guessed that just a couple days ago, every creek and river in the area had overflowed its banks and spilled angrily across the land. Now birds were singing, and the sun played golden beams over the pastures. Once again, Josephine was mesmerized by the beauty of the Montana countryside. The Blackwells' farm was just a few miles away, and it didn't take them long to reach their destination. As they pulled in the drive, they could see Mrs. Blackwell sweeping dirt and debris out of the cabin, and her husband was rebuilding a fence near the barn. Mrs. Blackwell appeared to be very pregnant, and there were 3 small children playing in the yard. Hello, Josephine called out as they approached. I'm Josephine. Looks like you're getting the place set to rights. Good morning, Mrs. Blackwell returned the greeting. My name's Jean. I'm afraid we've had some problems, as you can see. Mr. Blackwell came up to greet them and the 4 of them stood talking for a little while. It seemed Mr. Blackwell had built too close to the creek and the storm had caused the water to rise and come into the house, sweeping away many of their belongings. Jean and Earl, as the Blackwells urged Josephine and Ned to call them, were now in the process of trying to make the cabin habitable again. We've brought a few things we hope will help with that process, Josephine confided. It's not much, just a little food, some blankets, and such. Jean's eyes filled with tears as she watched the men unload the wagon. How can we thank you? She cried. Don't be silly. We're neighbors. Doesn't the Bible tell us to love our neighbors as we love ourselves? Any time you need help, as long as I am here, you may call on me. I'm sure the Connors feel the same way. Ned watched Josephine as she carried in some blankets, a sweet smile on her face. Absolutely, he agreed, grabbing up an armful of goods and lugging them toward the cabin. Outside of a slight grimace on his face, it wasn't obvious that he'd been hurt recently. We didn't know exactly what you needed, so, for now, we just brought the basics. We can come back tomorrow with more. Josephine was surprised that Ned made the unselfish offer. He was thinking of others instead of his own personal misery. Her heart gladdened. While they were at the Blackwells, Josephine helped Jean clean a good portion of the cabin and feed the children, and Ned did what he could to help Earl mend the fence, which admittedly wasn't much. Because his side was still tender, his movements were limited, but Earl was grateful for the assistance and maybe even more grateful for the company. They stayed for part of the afternoon and headed back to the ranch about 3. Josephine felt good about the day. They had helped people in need and, maybe even more importantly, she felt like she'd made a friend close to her own age. Tomorrow I'm going to take him some tools, like a new axe and some more wire for his fences, Ned spoke thoughtfully as they rode along. I have a feeling they didn't have much even before the flood. I think you're right, Ned. There sure weren't many supplies in the cabin. It's a shame they have so little. Maybe I could help him rebuild that cabin so it's farther away from the creek. That would be really nice of you, she answered, shocked that he was actually thinking so far ahead. He's going to need some assistance if he's going to make it out here. It's a lot different than where they came from back in Indiana. She couldn't help but smile with contentment as she looked at him. He really wasn't the selfish person she had thought he was. It turned out, he was truly kind and thoughtful. Chapter 8. The next few days took on a rhythm that was soothing to Josephine. Catherine came home full of stories about the damage the flood had done, and they worked together to find ways to help their affected neighbors. Ned kept his promise to return to the Blackwells and even pitched in as much as he was able to help some of the others who had suffered losses from the storm. Josephine jumped in to help around the ranch as much as possible. She helped plant the garden, and Kate gave her material to make pillowcases and baby clothes for Jean Blackwell's coming child. Ned was healing quickly and began to take on ranch work again, even deciding that the house was ready to be painted. Time sped by and Josephine was content. She found herself thinking about Ned a lot. She'd caught him humming a tune one afternoon when she went to the barn after his mother asked her to tell him lunch was ready. That was surely a good sign, wasn't it? She watched him as he climbed a ladder to scrape the house paint and was amazed by his fine physique. Muscles rippled as he moved his arm back and forth, his slim hips swaying slightly as he worked. She tried to turn away and quit staring at him, but she was mesmerized. Finally, she forced herself to turn back to weeding the garden but soon found her gaze creeping back to him. Watching him work was almost like watching a dancer. One day, when she was leaning on the corral fence watching the horses mill around, he came up behind her and asked, "Would you like to be riding one of those, Josie?" She whirled in surprise and gawked at him. Her? Ride a horse? The thought had never even occurred to her. She was a city girl, born and bred. And Josie? When did he start calling her by that nickname? No one had ever called her that before, but she liked the sound of it on his lips. I don't think I could, she shook her head emphatically. Nonsense. Anybody can learn to ride, and if you're going to be on this land, you need to know how to ride. But, she sputtered. Why don't you go ask Ma for some riding clothes, and I'll get Spirit ready for your first lesson. Come on, Josie, you're not afraid, are you? I didn't think you were afraid of anything. His teasing voice egged her on, even though she really was terrified to climb on top of one of those big beasts. She tilted her chin and eyed him suspiciously. Was this some kind of trick? It really is important for you to learn to ride. I promise I'll make sure you won't get hurt. Don't make promises you can't keep, Ned. Come on, I dare you. Oh, now that wasn't even fair. Josephine couldn't resist a dare. She straightened her spine and set her chin determinedly. Okay. If your mother has something I can wear, I'll do it. Without another word, she spun on her heel and marched toward the house to find Kate inside. When Josephine made her request and told her that Ned had offered to teach her to ride, Kate's face lit up with a huge smile. "Of course I have something you can wear," she said with a grin, "and I think it will fit you perfectly." They went into Kate's bedroom, and the older woman produced a brown leather split skirt and a brown and white striped shirt. "I think we wear about the same size boots, too." Josephine changed clothes and turned to head back to the barn. "Wait a minute, Joe, I've got something else for you." She opened the wardrobe and pulled a broad-brimmed beige hat from a shelf and sat it on Josephine's head. "There. Now you really look the part." Josephine caught sight of herself in the mirror and couldn't hide a smile. She looked like a cowgirl in these clothes. Now, if she just didn't feel so scared to get on that horse. She strode back to the corral where Ned was waiting for her. "Hey, you look great. Just wait here, Josie, and I'll bring out your horse." She waited nervously, wringing her hands and pacing back and forth. "Here you go," he called, and she turned to see him leading a huge, white horse toward her. It looked angry and towered over her, snorting and pawing at the ground. "Heaven help me," she groaned. He didn't actually expect her to ride that devil, did he? She approached it cautiously, then jumped back when the horse swung its big head back and forth, whinnying loudly. "What's wrong, Josie? You're not afraid of this big baby, are you?" "Baby? Baby? He looks more like an evil killer to me," she gasped. Just then, the horse danced toward her and she couldn't help it. She screeched and stumbled backward. Ned could no longer control his laughter. "Of course I'm kidding you. Hold on, I'll go get the real spirit and be right back." This time when he appeared, he was leading a small gray mare with a beautiful flowing mane and tail. White socks decorated 3 of her feet and long, spiked lashes fringed her big, gray eyes. "Now that looks more like it," Josephine said, and felt much better about approaching the little mare. The horse greeted her with a gentle push of its head, asking to be scratched between the ears. "That was mean, Ned, truly mean," she said, but couldn't help smiling a little at the joke he'd played on her. "I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. Demon is so scary looking. I thought you'd feel better about riding when I brought Spirit out to meet you. She's as gentle as a lamb, a darling girl. She's beautiful, aren't you, sweetheart?" she crooned to the animal. She felt a bond with the horse immediately, patting the mare's solid side. "Okay, remember, always approach a horse from the left," Ned told her. She accepted a helping hand from Ned and put her foot into his crossed palms as he boosted her up into the saddle. For a minute she felt dizzy. It seemed like she was so high off the ground that she would die if she fell off, and she grabbed Spirit's mane in both hands. "Here, hold on to the reins, not her mane," Ned said as he handed her the leather straps. "That's the way." They spent the next hour with Josephine on top of the horse, walking around the corral. First Ned led her as she sat tensely on top of Spirit, then he allowed her to take control of the animal. She walked her slowly around the grounds, starting to feel more confident with each circle she made. "Okay, I think that's enough for today," Ned said as she drew the horse to a halt. "How did you like it?" "I loved it. I love this horse. She is so sweet and gentle." "Okay. Let's get you down then." Ned reached up his hands and she felt him wrap them around her waist. Her breath caught at his touch, and she froze temporarily. "Come on, Josie. Just fling your leg over and slide down." She felt like she couldn't move for a moment, frozen by the feel of his hands on her body. Her breath came faster, and she was almost paralyzed. At last, she managed to get her leg over the top of Spirit's back, her hands gripping Ned's broad shoulders, and she let herself slide down to the ground. Her brown eyes met his blue ones, and they stood without moving for a long moment. She felt a zapping shock run through her, and her hands seemed to melt into his wide shoulders. Goodness, what was happening to her? Ned held her gaze, and they didn't move for the longest time. Josephine finally managed to make herself function and pulled away from him. This was frightening. She'd never felt such shock waves roll across her before. Why did she feel so strange, so weird? She didn't know what was happening, she just knew she needed to escape. "I've got to go," she finally managed to say and turned and ran toward the house. She didn't believe this. She felt like she was in a different world. It was such a foreign feeling that she was shivering and sweating at the same time. What was happening to her? Chapter 9. Ned watched the slim figure of Josephine as she disappeared into the house. He felt shaken down to his core. He hadn't felt anything even remotely like this since before Luann died. And he didn't like it. He felt disloyal to his late wife. He had loved her so much that having feelings for another woman seemed wrong. He didn't want to feel desire for someone else. He had committed himself to one woman. He almost felt angry at Josephine for awakening his desire for her. He thwacked his hat against his thigh. It wasn't right that he felt a yearning to see more of Josephine, a desire to taste her lips. Darn it all, he still loved Luann. He didn't want to feel anything for another woman. It just wasn't right. He was being disloyal to his late wife and that made him feel guilty as sin. He felt like smacking something. He wanted to kick and scream and howl. It wasn't fair that he wanted to grab Josephine and kiss her. Desire burned through him, and it scared him. He didn't want to want her, but he did. Ned turned and saw Ben coming across the barnyard. He didn't feel like talking to him right then. He was afraid Ben would see what was going on, and he didn't want anyone to know that he was craving Josephine. Before Ben could reach him, he turned and led Spirit into the barn to unsaddle her. He didn't want to talk to anybody about this, not now and maybe not ever. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Josephine flipped the frying potatoes so hard that some of them flew out of the pan and into the fire. She was still upset over the scene with Ned. She shouldn't be bothered by it, she told herself again. Nothing happened. No, nothing but a rush of emotions that she didn't understand. She wasn't interested in him as a man, not at all. She was going to marry God, dedicate her life to him. That was her plan. She didn't desire Ned, she couldn't. It wasn't in the plan for her future. She knew that. She was just letting herself get worked up over nothing. Catherine came into the kitchen and eyed Josephine carefully. She thought the girl looked upset about something but she had no clue what it could be. She wanted to ask her but bit her tongue. Instead, she got out the dishes and started to set the table. Ned and Ben appeared a few minutes later. They were both hungry and sat down at the table eager for supper. Ned avoided Josephine's gaze when she came into the dining room carrying the platter of pork chops and the bowl of fried potatoes. She didn't look at him either, but she greeted Ben warmly. There was a strain at the dinner table that evening, but Josephine was determined to overcome it. She didn't want anyone to think she was worried about anything, so she chatted brightly about the beautiful weather and how well the garden was doing. "The radishes are already up, and I even picked a few for supper," she said, pointing at the small plate that held a dozen small radishes. "And look, there are green onions ready, too." "That's fine, Joe, just fine." "You certainly do have a green thumb," Kate said. "There's going to be a box lunch on Saturday to raise money for the flood victims," Ben put in. "Some of those radishes and green onions will make a nice addition to your box, Joe." "Oh, I wasn't planning on going to that," she said quickly. "That's more for women that are interested in attracting suitors." "No, you're wrong, Joe," Kate told her. "All the ladies are participating, even the married ones. Of course, their husbands will be expected to bid on their boxes, but this is a community affair. You'll want to be a part of it. There's also going to be a bake sale, races, and a dance. The whole family's going and that includes you." Rats, Josephine thought. She really didn't want to go, but she supposed she didn't have a choice. She would just have to try to avoid Ned that day. She finished her meal quietly and didn't waste any time afterward going to the kitchen to clean up. She really just wanted to be alone at that moment. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Of course, it turned out that avoiding Ned was going to be hard to do, she realized as they loaded into the wagon on Saturday. She and Kate were on the seat, their decorated boxes in the bed behind them along with a couple of pies, a cake, and 3 dozen cookies for the bake sale. Ben and Ned both rode their horses, but they stayed close to the wagon as they rolled along into town. The river was still high, but the bridge was crossable, and they made the trip embraced by golden sunshine and gentle breezes. It was a perfect day for a picnic. People thronged the town. Kate had been right. It seemed everyone had turned out for the festivities. One of the first activities was a short horse race. Josephine waved at Jean Blackwell and a few other people she had met during the previous weeks. Then, she carefully stood to the side as horses galloped down the street as they raced for the finish line. There were also sack races, a relay where men ran with raw eggs on spoons, and even a log-cutting competition. The box lunches were auctioned off in front of the church. Josephine watched as baskets and boxes decorated with ribbons and flowers were sold to the highest bidder. Kate's box was put up early, and Josephine saw a rare blush cross the older woman's cheeks when Sheriff Bedloe bid on and won the white basket. Miss Penny, the owner of the saloon, created a bidding war with her blue velvet box. Josephine noticed that Ned was one of the eager bidders. Wouldn't you know it? He still had a penchant for liquor and apparently for Miss Penny, too. Ned dropped out of the bidding when a big, burly cowboy bid $5 on it. Then it was time for Josephine's box to go on the block. Ned and Ben both bid on it. She was sure they were doing it just to be polite. Even a couple of strangers bid on it as well, but Ned looked determined and ended up winning it. Josephine's stomach fell as she heard the auctioneer declare Ned the winner. Now she would have to eat with him, for heaven's sake. This was exactly the opposite of what she'd planned. She didn't want to be alone with him, but now she had no choice. Ned collected their lunch and walked to Josephine's side with a grin. "Let's go down by the river and eat, Josie. It will be nice there on a beautiful day like this." "I think we should stay here in the churchyard, Ned." "Why? Are you afraid of me?" She wanted to shout yes, she was. She didn't want to be alone with him, but she also didn't want to act like a fool. Reluctantly, she followed Ned to the river bank, and he spread the blanket they had brought under a tall tree that cast shade over the area. "Now, let's see what we have in here. Fried chicken and potato salad. I'm starving. Let's eat." He ate with enthusiasm and soon Josephine found herself relaxing. Just because she had felt attracted to him the day she rode Spirit didn't mean she couldn't still enjoy his company, did it? He talked about the townsfolk and the impending statehood Montana was looking forward to, and she listened to the melodic flow of his voice. She loved the sound of its deep, rich tone. When he'd finished eating, Ned lay back on the blanket, his arms folded beneath his head as he gazed at the sky through the sparse branches. "Hey, look, that cloud there looks like a galloping horse." Josephine lay down as well and saw exactly what he was talking about. "It does. And look, that one looks like an old man's face." They lay and studied the clouds floating over them, and before long Josephine felt herself nodding off. A gentle snore from Ned let her know that he, too, had succumbed to the comfort of the beautiful day. In the background, the sound of children laughing and playing sounded like a lullaby, and the river gurgled as it rolled by. She let herself breathe in the sweet spring air and soon dropped into a slumber. "Josie. Hey, Josie, wake up." Ned's voice was calling to her, but she didn't really hear it well. She came wide awake, though, when she felt him lean over and drop a kiss on her forehead. Her eyelids flew open and she found herself looking straight into his clear blue eyes. Suddenly, her heart was churning and heat flashed through her body. Oh, God, this is exactly what she hadn't wanted to happen. "I couldn't resist. You look so pretty lying there." He looked abashed but didn't turn away. She found it impossible to tear her gaze from his. This wasn't good, it wasn't good at all. "Hey, we've slept the afternoon away. We better get back before the whole town comes looking for us," Ned said gently. Oh, you're right. Come on, let's go. She got to her feet and quickly started gathering up the blanket and the basket. Together, they strode quickly back toward town. Once again, she'd allowed herself to fall under this man's spell. Would she never learn? They still had to get through the dance, though. Josephine wasn't a very experienced dancer, but it didn't seem like anyone cared. All the men took turns dancing with her, whisking her around the dance floor of the barn where the festivities were being held. She found herself laughing all evening. But then Ned asked her for the last dance. He took her in his arms, and her breath caught in her throat. He glided gracefully across the floor, humming the tune in her ear as they danced. Nothing had prepared her for the experience, and she wasn't laughing anymore. She couldn't decide if she was glad when the dance was over or if she wished it would go on all night. Chapter 10. Days slid by and Josephine managed to stay away from Ned for the most part. That didn't stop her from thinking about him, though. He seemed like he was doing better than when she had first arrived in Montana. He seemed happier, even almost content. She liked to think that maybe she had played a small role in his improved attitude, but she still worried about her feelings for him. She found her mind often roaming back to thoughts of him. One day, she was in the barn visiting Spirit when he came in from the fields. He greeted her kindly and talked about his visit with the Blackwells. He had spent quite a bit of time with them since the flood, helping the husband to learn about ranching. She was proud of how giving he'd been, how much he seemed to care about the little family. Josephine soon made her excuses and made her way to the house. She didn't want to feel pride in Ned. She didn't want to feel anything for him except to care for him as her brother in Christ. Apparently, that wasn't meant to be, however, she knew for sure when she started having dreams about him. She dreamt about being in his arms, about kissing him, about running her hands through his lush black hair. One day, he got up early and left before breakfast. Kate, Ben, and she were alone at the table when Ben mentioned that it was already the last day of June, and Josephine confessed that it was her birthday. "Well, now," Ben said, "that calls for a celebration. I'm taking you to town for lunch today." "Oh, no. I didn't want anyone to do anything for me. It's just that you mentioned the date and it reminded me." "That doesn't matter. I need to go into town anyway and pick up some supplies. You get ready, and we'll go." "Yes, Joe, do go. You deserve a special meal that you didn't have to cook for yourself." Kate urged Josephine to enjoy the day and go out to lunch with Ben. Joe finally relented and went to put on a pretty blue dress and a bonnet with flowers sprinkled on it. She tied the ribbons in a jaunty bow and allowed herself a smile. God was good, he'd let her make it through another year. Ben went to the feed store and the livery, then they headed over to the cafe for lunch. She enjoyed spending time with him. He had a great sense of humor and could talk about any subject intelligently. But then he brought up a subject that made her uncomfortable. "Josephine, how have you and Ned been getting along lately?" he asked. "Fine, I guess. He does seem better than he used to be, not so gloomy, anyway." "And he is. He's almost like his old self. He whistles while he works again, and he's smiled more lately than he has in years. You know, it was Kate and I that placed that advert in the paper. It was for a mail-order bride, you realize, right?" Josephine took a bite of her fried fish and nodded. "Yes, but that's not why I came. I'm not interested in getting married. Sister Agnes thought it would be doing a Christian kindness if I came and tried to help him. And you have helped, immensely." Ben wiped his mouth with his napkin. "I think you're the perfect match for Ned. You know his faults, but you still like him, don't you? You see that he is really a good man." "Yes, I like him, Ben, but I'm going to be a nun. That's what I've always wanted to do with my life." "Plans change, Joe. You would be a great wife and mother. That's another way of serving the Lord, you know. But that's not what I want. I admit, I've been feeling conflicted when it comes to Ned. I've even been having dreams about him. But it's just not in my plan, Ben." Ben eyed her with concern and laid his hand over hers. Listen, Joe, please don't make this decision hastily. Think about it and pray about it. I will, but I don't think my answer will change. That's all I can ask, Joe. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Ned stood outside the cafe and looked in the window. Was that really Ben and Josie in there? Together? And Ben's hand was on top of Joe's. He didn't want to believe what he was seeing. Ben and Joe. He didn't like that, he didn't like it at all. He'd been thinking about Joe a lot lately, and he had almost come to the conclusion that a relationship with her wouldn't be a bad idea. He knew in his heart that Luann wouldn't want him to be alone for the rest of his life. She wasn't like that. She was kind and loving and would want him to be happy. So just when he was coming to that conclusion, he discovered this. Ned and Joe together. It hurt him to see his best friend with the woman he had started thinking of as his girl. It felt like a knife stabbing him right in the heart. He should have known better. If he was meant to have a partner in life, the Lord wouldn't have taken Luann away from him. He wouldn't be alone now. He hadn't even been allowed to keep the baby. His face hardened as he watched the couple inside talking and laughing. It was obvious. The two were falling in love and he was alone, again. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Josephine couldn't stop thinking about what Ben had told her. He and Kate truly hoped she would marry Ned. In the first place, Ned had never even brought up the subject of them being married, and in the second place, she had no intention of ever marrying anyone besides the Lord. Yet a part of her couldn't stop thinking about the idea. What would it be like to be married to Ned? To sleep next to him, to bear his children? She imagined a little girl with big blue eyes and a little boy with soft black hair. She pictured herself large with child, feeling the unborn babe moving within her, and a small smile crept across her face. But no, that wasn't going to happen. Ned Connor might be handsome, he might even be kind and loving, but he was not going to be her husband. She shoved the thought determinately out of her mind. She didn't even want to think about it. But time and again, the images crept in her thoughts. She was still having dreams of the man, and they were becoming more and more vivid. Now she was kissing him, deeply and passionately, in those dreams. Her hands skimmed along his flesh and she could almost feel his hands rubbing across her back. She might be innocent and untouched, but she wasn't ignorant. She knew what went on between husbands and wives, knew it took intimacy to a level she had never known and probably never would know. She refused to even think about that when she was awake, but she had no control over her dreams, and almost every night now Ned crept into her illusions. It had gotten so bad, she almost dreaded to go to sleep. This morning, she had woken early, even before the sun came up. Her skin was drenched with sweat, and her breathing was rapid and shallow. Ned had been lying in bed beside her, his arms wrapped around her, pulling her close to him. God help her, she had to get over this. She felt as if she were going mad. Chapter 11. She climbed wearily out of bed and lit a lamp. Picking up her Bible, she attempted to read it and tried to find peace. Always before, reading the Bible had calmed her, made her feel better, no matter the situation. But it wasn't working this time. Somehow she had turned to the Song of Solomon. The verses were all about love and relationships and only made the flame of desire burn brighter within her heart. His left arm is under my head, and his right arm embraces me, she read. God help her, she was so confused. Even her relationship with God the Father had been tainted by Ned. She closed the book and leaned her head back against the rocker she sat in. She simply didn't understand why she felt this way about Ned. He wasn't perfect by any means, far from it. He drank too much, and didn't live a godly life. Maybe she could comprehend this better if he were a good Christian man who had a strong relationship with God. Maybe she could have some glimmer of comprehension if he were a minister or a clergyman. But he wasn't. He was just a man, a simple human with faults and blemishes. Why, she wondered, why did he haunt her dreams and infest her thoughts? Finally, she gave up and got dressed and went downstairs to start breakfast. She was early, so she had plenty of time to make a breakfast casserole and hash brown potatoes. Maybe that would take her mind off of Ned. After breakfast was over, she did the dishes and mopped the floor, then went out to work in the garden. She needed to stay busy, to keep her mind occupied. If she didn't, her thoughts would turn back to Ned, and that was the last thing she wanted. She spent an hour or two in the garden, then went back to the house and washed all the windows. Then she carried the rugs out and laid them over the clothesline so she could beat them vigorously with a wicker contraption made for that purpose. By the time she was finished with that, she was exhausted and decided she would try to take a nap. Maybe she wouldn't dream about Ned during the daytime. She could only hope. It didn't take long for her to fall asleep, and this time it was dreamless. When she woke up, she felt better than she had in a few days and was stretching her arms high above her head when she heard laughter from below. Curious, she opened the doors to the balcony and stepped out. At first, she didn't see anyone. Then, beneath an apple tree, she spotted them. It was Ned, and he was with a woman Josephine recognized by her flaming red hair. Miss Penny, the saloon owner, was laughing up at something Ned had said, and he was grinning back at her. Josephine jerked when she saw the woman run her hand up Ned's arm and tickle his ear. So, that's the way it was. Ned had a thing for Miss Penny. The two were obviously in a relationship, and from the looks of things, it wasn't a casual acquaintance. She should be happy for them. She should be glad that Ned had found someone he was interested in, someone he was attracted to. But she wasn't glad. She wasn't glad at all. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Ned wasn't at supper that evening, and Josephine figured she knew why. He was somewhere with Miss Penny. That was okay. She would tell Kate and Ben her news. They could pass it along to Ned if they wanted. "I'm going back to St. Michael's at the end of the week," she told them. "I've overstayed my welcome as it is, and I really am needed back at the convent. I have to complete my training to become a nun, and I feel like the time is now." "Oh, Josephine, must you go so soon? We will all miss you terribly. Won't you stay a while longer?" Kate pleaded with her and took her hands in her own. "You know I've come to love you like a daughter. I don't want you to leave. I love you too, Catherine, but I really must go. The Lord is calling me back to St. Michael's." "Joe, did you think about what we talked about the other day? Did you really consider your options?" Ben's face wore a look of concern as he questioned her. "I did, Ben, and I know now this is what I must do. I'd like to take my final vows before autumn is over." They both shook their heads, and Kate had tears in her eyes as she voiced her disappointment, but Josephine wouldn't be swayed. She was determined to go. She spent the next few days packing her things and making arrangements for her journey. She knew Ned had been told of her plans. She could tell by the way he looked at her, but he didn't say anything. Maybe if he had asked her to stay she could have been swayed, because in truth, she wasn't sure it was God calling her back or her own lack of courage. But Ned's silence said it all as far as she was concerned. Her last day on the ranch was a sad one. She wandered around and said her goodbyes to Spirit and to the dogs, Mike and Molly. She even went to visit the chickens one last time and wandered past the corrals to give several of the horses a farewell pat. Part of her didn't want to leave the ranch, and she knew she would miss the beautiful countryside and the brisk mountain air. She had never seen a place like this before and doubted she ever would again. Maybe the church would send her back to this area someday. She knew they had a charity for the Indians somewhere near here. Perhaps she could work there someday. Kate fixed a special dinner for her that night. Jean and Earl Blackwell and their children came, Sheriff Bedloe was there, and of course, Ned and Ben attended. "I'm sorry you won't be here to see our latest edition, Joe," Jean said as she helped her wash dishes after the meal. "I'm due in just a couple of weeks now. I wish I could stay, Jean, but you know I wish you well. I hope you have a beautiful, healthy baby. I still don't understand why you feel so strongly about leaving right away," Jean said as she took another plate to dry. "None of us do, Jean." "I think she's just being stubborn," Kate said as she wiped the kitchen table with a wet rag. I already miss her. Oh, Kate, I'll miss you terribly, too, but I have to do what I think is right. I know, Joe, I know. But somehow, it doesn't feel right to me. She couldn't quite hide the sound of her sniffing back tears, and Josephine's heart wrenched. She knew she was hurting Kate, and she hated it, but she had to listen to the voice of God telling her to go back to Maryland. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. It's not too late to change your mind, you know, Joe, Ben said as he carried her bags toward the train. You can still decide to stay. What and waste all the money it cost for my ticket, she teased, trying to keep the tears from her eyes. Well, if you decide you made the wrong decision, you can always come back. Thank you, Ben, and you know I'll write. You better. After all, we'll want to know when you officially become Sister Josephine. Sister Josephine. It has a nice ring to it, don't you think? Not as nice as Mrs. Connor would sound. She smiled sadly and kissed him on the cheek goodbye. Chapter 12. Josephine felt tired and worn by the time she got back to St. Michael's. The trip home felt like it had taken twice as long as the journey to Montana. Everything about the convent felt smaller, more crowded. She guessed she had been spoiled by the wide-open space in Bitterroot Valley. She missed Kate and Ben, too. She had to admit, though, she missed Ned the most. She still had dreams about him, still found him creeping into most of her waking thoughts. She prayed every day that God would help her to forget about him, but so far the answer hadn't come. Sister Agnes welcomed her back with open arms but noticed a definite change in her. The older woman could easily see that Josephine was quieter, less talkative than she had been before her adventure out west. She was still helpful and kind, just as good with the children and the elderly as she had always been, but something was missing. She didn't seem to have the zest for living she used to have, almost as if her spirit was broken. She was thinner, too, and didn't have much of an appetite. The nun worried that it was her fault. Maybe she shouldn't have insisted Josephine go to Montana. Maybe it had been a mistake. Josephine was urging her to speed up her training and allow her to become a nun as soon as possible, but Sister Agnes was hesitant. There was no going back once Josephine took that final step. She loved Josephine like she was her own daughter, and she only wanted her to be happy. She wanted to get to the bottom of the changes she'd noticed in Josephine. She was going to do some investigating on her own. Her order sponsored a charity for the Indians in Montana, and she decided it was time someone checked in to make sure it was running well. Perhaps she would take her own trip out west and do just that. And while she was there, she thought she would pay a visit to the Circle C ranch and see if she could figure out the problem. The Connors were about to get another visitor from St. Michael's. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Darn it, Ned, what is wrong with you? That's the second time this week you forgot to close the corral gate. The horses got out again. Ben shook his head in disgust. If I had to guess, I'd say you were mooning over Josephine leaving. Don't be stupid, Ben. If anyone should be upset about her going back, I would think it would be you. After all, you're the one who was sweet on her. Are you kidding? Me and Josephine? Whatever gave you a crazy idea like that? I saw you, Ben, that day you were in town with her. You and Josephine sitting at a table in the cafe. You were holding her hand and everything. You are nuts, Ned Connor. I liked Jo, sure, but not in the way you're thinking. She's a good friend, and I know she's a good woman, but I've been fixing to tell you and Kate. I plan on building a house down the road apiece. A home for me and my bride. I'm getting married to Miranda Brown come Christmas. Ned's mouth fell open at Ben's words. Miranda Brown? That woman whose husband ran off and left her a couple of years ago? That's the one. Her divorce is final now, so I can tell the world. I'm going to make Miranda Brown my wife. Well, I'll be hornswoggled. Ned scratched his head in surprise. I didn't even know you'd been calling on her. That's because you've had your head buried so deep in your own heartache you couldn't pay attention to nothing else. Least not until Josephine came along. Now you've gone and let her slip away. You're not too bright, brother. Ned stared at him hard. Maybe you're right, Ben. Maybe you're right. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Sister Agnes didn't tell Josephine where she was going. She just said that she had church business to take care of and would be gone for a couple of months. Just keep on with your training, and by the time I get back, you'll probably be ready to take your vows, she told her. Now Sister Agnes was sitting in the Connors' front room visiting with Kate and Ned. He was a handsome man, she had to admit. A little rough around the edges, but Agnes considered herself a good judge of character, and Ned Connor passed muster with her. He loved his mother, she could tell, and he seemed to have a good sense of humor. He kept good care of his ranch and he had loved his first wife soul deep. Ned, I want you to be honest with me. Do you have any feelings for Josephine? He looked her straight in the eyes before answering. Yes, ma'am, I do. She's the only person who made me feel alive again, who made me want to go on living. I was falling in love with her, but then she just up and announced she was leaving. And you didn't ask her to stay? No wonder she left, young man. You didn't give her a clue how you felt, did you? He shrugged and looked a bit shamefaced. No, ma'am, I guess I didn't. Well, then, you have two choices now. One, you can choose to let her walk away from you and become a nun. If that happens, there will be no chance of ever getting her back. Or two, you can go back to St. Michael's with me and tell her how you feel. I think you'll find she feels the same about you. He stood up from his chair and paced over to stare out the window. I don't think she does, sister. If she does, she sure had a good way of hiding it. Sister Agnes drew in a deep breath as she studied him. Josephine is not the same young woman who left to come out here a few months ago. There's an air of sadness about her now. Like she's lost something dear to her. I think that something might be you. Chapter 13. Josephine had to admit, she had missed the ocean views when she was in Montana. There was something powerful about the ocean that touched her soul. She spent hours down by the beach, just staring at the waves. She looked out across the miles of water and imagined what lay on the other side. She also thought a lot about what was underneath it. So many kinds of sea life called the Atlantic home. She might not be able to see them all, but she knew there were crabs, lobsters, shrimp, and octopi all living in the water. Not to mention sharks, and dolphins, whales, swordfish and tons of other sea life out there in the depths of the ocean. She loved to walk along the sandy shores and collect a variety of seashells with all their various shapes and colors. She often went back to the convent with her pockets stuffed with treasures, everything from odd-shaped little pieces of driftwood to stones that had been polished to a smooth, glossy shimmer by the waves. She'd missed the seafood as well. She loved to eat crab cakes and the shrimp here was absolutely delicious. Clam chowder and lobster tasted like ambrosia and grilled tuna made a heavenly meal. But now, she found herself craving fresh salmon and fried buffalo steak, venison, and succulent pheasant. She missed the mountains, too, and the endless sky and thousands of stars that came out at night. She often found herself yearning to be back in Montana, breathing the fresh, sweet air and enjoying the sounds of nature. It seemed she just couldn't be happy anymore. She even found her mind wandering back to the Bitterroot Valley while she was studying the Bible or attending Mass. She didn't know how long it would take, but she was determined to get Montana off her mind and focus on her work with the church. She threw herself into doing whatever she could to focus on becoming a nun. She worked tirelessly with the orphans, teaching them and guiding them through life's ups and downs. The littlest ones were especially dear to her. She had to smile at their gap-toothed grins and their vivid imaginations. Sometimes she allowed herself to get lost in their imaginary worlds and become a princess or a pirate. It upset her, though, when they wanted to play cowboys and Indians. That was an immediate trigger to take her mind back to Montana, the horses, the crystal waters, and the towering mountains. The children loved to listen to her tell stories about Montana. She told them about how beautiful the land was, how green the trees and blue the skies. They listened raptly as she talked about horses and cattle, about bears and wolves. They were full of questions about Indians, about how the cowboys took the cattle to market, and even about the saloons. She thanked God for the children. They kept her busy and kept her laughing. She played games with them and sang songs with them. She kissed their boo-boos and dried their tears. She listened to their prayers and tucked them in at night. And over, it made her think about what it would be like to have children of her own. She couldn't tamp down the longing that was growing inside of her to be a mother, but that was never going to happen. She would have to be satisfied with mothering the many orphans she helped care for instead. She wrote Kate long letters and looked forward to receiving her chatty missives. They were always full of news. Jean and Earl had had a baby girl that they named Patricia. Sheriff Bedloe had begun earnestly courting Catherine, and she seemed to be thrilled about it. She wrote that Ben was getting married in December, and Josephine was ecstatic for him. He was a good man and deserved to be happily married. What she didn't say much about was Ned. Josephine asked her about him in her letters, but Kate never said more than that he was well. She thought it a little strange but put it off to her disappointment that things hadn't worked out for Ned and her. She hadn't denied that she would love to have Josephine for a daughter-in-law. Josephine got a letter from Sister Agnes as well. It was short. She just said that she would be returning home in a week or so and that she was having a pleasant trip. She told Josephine she missed her and she hoped she was working hard on preparing to take her vows. And Josephine was. She felt ready to commit her life to the church. She didn't really know another life, and she was comfortable living with the other ladies. At least her life wasn't complicated with things like romantic imaginings and relationships. It was Thursday afternoon when Josephine went to the chapel to spend some time in prayer. She dropped to her knees in front of the chapel, made the sign of the cross and began to pray in earnest. She had a lot on her mind and felt compelled to discuss it with the Lord. She spent the first few moments of her prayer thanking Him for His goodness, for all the blessings He had poured into her life. She'd never forgotten that if it hadn't been for the church, her life could have been a nightmare. A parentless little girl had few options in life and most of them didn't paint a pretty picture. She would be eternally grateful that the nuns had taken her in and especially for Sister Agnes who was as close to a mother as Josephine would ever have. And Heavenly Father, I pray that you will watch out for the people in Montana. Please take care of Kate and Ben and especially Ned. Help to keep him from drinking too much and falling back into bad habits, help him find the good in life and let him be happy. I think it will take you in my life to make me happy. A voice came from behind her and Josephine froze in position. She couldn't believe it. The voice sounded exactly like Ned. She must be losing her mind. Now, she wasn't just dreaming about him, she was actually hearing his voice. Cautiously she turned her head. Oh, dearest God. It was Ned. He was standing behind her in the chapel. Stunned, she rose to her feet and turned to face him. Ned. It really is you. It's me, Josie. I came because I couldn't stay away. Still not believing her eyes, she reached out and touched him. He felt like Ned, like flesh and blood. Goodness, he was really here. Josie, I had to see you. I was a fool. I let you walk away without telling you how I really feel. But you, and Miss Penny, I thought, her voice trailed off, still in shock. You thought Penny and I were together? No, Josephine, no way. Penny is a friend of mine, a good friend, but she's not for me. It's you who brought me back to life. Ned took her by the arm and led her to a pew and sat her down. He sat next to her and took her hand in his and looked straight into her eyes. Josephine, I never told you what a difference you made in my life. You came to Montana and lit up the world. You were always happy, always smiling. Without hesitating, you helped me when I was hurt and then you helped others who were harmed by the flood. You are a very special person, Josephine, and I don't want to lose you. What do you mean? I don't understand. She stared at him, her mind whirling. What I mean is I love you. I should have told you before I let you get on that train. My heart was broken all over again when you left. When Luann died along with my baby, I thought my world had ended, but then you came into it. You came in spitting and fighting, telling me off for punching Ben, and you challenged me to start living again. I accept that challenge, Josie, if you are part of that life. I want you to stay with me, to love me, to marry me. I want to spend the rest of my days loving you. But I'm going to be a nun. I've always planned on becoming a nun. You know what they say about the best laid plans, Josephine. Besides, you are doing a service to the Lord by becoming my wife. I'm sure I remember a verse that says something like, "He who finds a wife finds what is good and receives favor from the Lord." Goodness, Ned, is that you? Are you quoting the Bible to me? He laughed and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. You've reformed me, Josie. What else can I say? I have to admit I can't forget you, Ned. You're on my mind day and night. You are even in my dreams. She laid her head on his chest and listened to his heartbeat. I think that's the Lord's way of trying to tell me we belong together. I think you're right, Josie. I feel like it's what God wants you to do. To be my wife, to bear my children, to make me the happiest man on earth and make yourself happy, too. I believe God wants us to be happy. He tells us in the Bible he does. She nodded, tears filling her eyes. She hadn't planned on this, had never thought she would be anything besides a nun. But as Ned said, the best laid plans change. And now they were changing for what she knew was better for her. Will you pray with me, Josie? Pray with me that the Lord will bless our marriage and help us through the good times and the bad, that he will keep us safe and joyful for as long as we both shall live. Together they got up and moved to the altar and knelt before it. Ned led them in prayer, and Josie thought he spoke the most beautiful words she had ever heard. When he was finished, she whispered amen and looked into his beautiful blue eyes. I love you, Josie. Will you marry me before we go back to Montana? Yes, Ned, I will. I love you, too, but I have one condition. He studied her, worry clouding his eyes. What is it, Josie? I'll do anything you say. I want Sister Agnes's blessing. Relief washed over his face. I do, too, honey. Let's go and tell her and see if she approves. She's back? Josie asked, her heart soaring. She's back. We came together. Walking hand in hand, they left the chapel and went to tell Sister Agnes their good news. After Josie threw herself into Agnes's arms, Sister Agnes smiled and blessed them, but she wasn't surprised. Not at all. She had felt deeply that Josephine had another calling in life. Josephine was meant to be Mrs. Ned Connor all along. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.